Welcome back, everyone. We are today going to have this last session for the day. So, we were discussing poverty, and we had discussed absolute and relative poverty as two types of poverty. So, you're not able to understand relative poverty. It'll be easier for you to understand if you understand absolute and relative poverty in comparison. In absolute poverty, we were saying that we created a line of basic needs and necessities. And if there are people below this line who do not reach this threshold, were considered below poverty line. And this was the targeted group for the government, that these are the people who need government intervention, who need to be, say, part of various schemes, initiatives, etc. But when you talk about absolute poverty, they were saying they're still creating a line, but it'll be of the percentage of people who are below this threshold. Now, this threshold is not based on basic needs. What they'll do is, if you think of your developed nations, you find that you do not have a lot of people who suffer when it comes to basic needs. So, your developed nations prefer this line or this relative poverty concept. What they say is, yes, there are people who are not struggling with basic needs, but then again, there are people who do not have enough assets, who do not have, say, enough wealth compared to other members of the society. So what they do is, to basically minimize the gap between the rich and the poor, they consider bottom certain percentage of the population, say they can say 10%. Bottom 10 percentage of the population, for instance, will be considered relatively poor. Now, these relatively poor in this case might have all the basic necessities, might even afford a car, but they'll still be considered poor in developed nations. This is what the difference and the idea of absolute and relative poverty is. Moving on, we were discussing the vicious cycle of poverty, wherein we had explained that the causes of poverty becomes the consequences of poverty. That's what we said. And we were saying that this cycle is vicious because there is no way you can break this cycle on your own. You'll only find exceptions when it comes to people breaking this vicious cycle of poverty. Otherwise, government intervention is required at one or the other stage to break this vicious cycle of poverty. And I was saying that if you take up various causes of poverty and various consequences of poverty, you can create this vicious cycle of poverty. Now, if we have to think about the causes of poverty, we are again going to think in terms of economic causes of poverty, political causes of poverty, socio-cultural causes of poverty, and environmental causes of poverty. This is what our basic framework is going to look like. And we have seen that how there can be certain groups of people who are deprived when it comes to political power, who are deprived when it comes to various economic indicators, who can be deprived of basic educational and your healthcare facilities, etc. So these all dimensions are the basic dimensions of causes of poverty. Now again, I would repeat that the questions that they generally target are from various socio-cultural causes and reasons of poverty. And you have to remember the other part as well, that these causes of poverty are going to become the consequences of poverty as well. So what I'll do is I'll try to create this vicious cycle of poverty, or I'll try to portray how these causes become consequences in the case of few of these factors. And then you have to repeat the same exercise if at all any question comes in the examination. So let's start with your economic causes of poverty first. When you think of economic causes of poverty, first let's take up fiscal deficit. If the government is under fiscal deficit, they would not have sufficient to spend on the social sector. They would not have sufficient to spend on various programs and policies meant for poverty alleviation. If they are not able to spend on, say, healthcare of people, then people would not have good health indicators. If people do not have good health indicators, they would not be productive. And if these people are not productive, ultimately they would not be able to contribute to the economic development of the country, and ultimately the country will remain in this fiscal deficit. Similarly, if you think of inflation, if there is high inflation in the society or in a particular country, think about household. Now, when you look at these causes and the consequences, you can look through the lens of state or the government, or you can look at the household level as well. So you can create the cycle, or a question can be asked in terms of state or in the terms of household. Now think of inflation. If there is inflation, and recently there was particularly high inflation in case of one of the vegetables, that is tomato. So tomatoes became very expensive, so much so that it was way beyond the reach of even your middle class. Now think of the poorest of the poor. With the rising levels of inflation, would they be able to afford any kind of commodities? Because we know that when it comes to nutritious diet, it is generally expensive compared to your junk food, compared to something which is low or which is not very dense in nutrients. So take the prices of your pulses, legumes, take the prices of anything which is proteinaceous, your milk-based, dairy-based products. They are generally very expensive, way beyond the reach of the poorest. So if there is inflation, they would not be able to earn for themselves. And ultimately, this inflation can become a cause of poverty. Now, if there is inflation in the society, if there is inflation in the country, people would not get sufficient to eat. People would not get sufficient to produce. So basically, your raw material for agriculture, for instance, will also become expensive. Your irrigation facilities will also become expensive. Now, if there is this inflation, if the production levels are low, because of low production levels, you'll find that there'll be a problem related to supply. The supply has decreased, but demand remains constant. What happens in that case? In that case, you fall back in the bracket of inflation again. Similarly, if the levels of inflation are very low, you'll find that the government would not be able to start the virtuous cycle of production and development. There'll be a lot less demand of products, or the supply will be sufficient, but there'll be a lot less demand. Because of which, what will happen is there'll be a lower supply of goods. There'll be lower, the number of jobs and employment opportunities will be less. Because of which, they would not be able to provide employment for everyone. If they are not able to provide employment for everyone, ultimately, people will fall in the poverty bracket again. So inflation reduces purchasing power of people. Yes, it does. That's the example that we gave. Similarly, if there is lack of basic infrastructure can be related to health. Basic infrastructure can be related to your road and railways network. If these are not available, if people cannot access this basic infrastructure, then again, you can go by the health logic, you can go by the education logic, you can go by, say, your road infrastructure logic. How? That if you do not have proper road infrastructure, how do you expect students to go to school? If you do not have basic infrastructure like roads, railways, how do people go to work? Which can ultimately lead to unemployment or lower income levels. Because ultimately, if you want to take up a better occupation, if you want to take up more remunerative occupation, you would have to travel to another place. Similarly, we see that you can relate these economic factors to development. Just keep this in mind. We'll be coming back to this idea after we're done with the causes and consequences of inflation. So we see that if the levels of development increase, the levels of inflation also increase. So just keep that in mind. We'll come back to this idea. Then there is uneven rate of development across the country. Now, this uneven rate of development will push the marginalized sections at the bottom. They would not be able to avail various services. They would not be able to get decent education, healthcare, etc. With commercialize of education, you see that with globalization and urbanization, now you have more and more corporate players, now you have more and more MNCs entering each and every domain. Now your commercialization of agriculture can be understood as contract farming as well. Now it is not just limited to contract farming, I'm just giving an example. So if commercialization of agriculture happens, these MNCs will get in contract with the farmers, and they will ask the farmers to give their produce at a lot less rate compared to what is the prevalent market rate. But they get these contracts done beforehand, so these farmers cannot say no. So even if their cost of input increases tomorrow, they would have no option but to sell their produce to these companies at a cheaper price or at the decided price, which can also lead to their impoverishment. Similarly, when it comes to agriculture in general, you'll find there are a lot of black marketing practices. The middlemen take most of the profit that is being generated from agriculture, and ultimately this is making agriculture uh, not very profitable. Agriculture, you see that already it is not very profitable, particularly for the farmers with small land holdings and your landless farmers. Now also, this uh, non-profitability and your lack of productivity from agriculture will lead to farmer suicides. So if there are more farmer suicides, you'll find that people will stay away from agriculture. People would not want to get engaged in agriculture. Why? Because it is not productive, it is not profitable. And if they do not get engaged in agriculture, the chances are that they would not also get any kind of labor in the cities as well. Because now, with the service sector, if you remember from our demographic transition, we see that most of the jobs are now created by your service sector. And your service sector needs highly specialized skills. And if you do not have those highly specialized skills, you would not be able to earn a decent income. Then, if there is a lack of skilled human resource, if the human resources that are there of the people of working age, if they're not skilled properly, they would not be able to get any kind of good employment. They would not be able to get remunerative employment because of their low levels of skilling and education, which will also lead ultimately to poverty. And now if they're poor, they would not be able to afford any kind of education and skilling, neither for themselves nor for their children, and ultimately the cycle repeats itself. So I hope you're getting the idea that how these causes of poverty become consequences of poverty. Now again, I'll say that the economic factors that we have looked into, it is not an exhaustive list, it is a limited list. But again, from your paper 1 and 2 perspective, the questions that are asked are generally from socio-cultural factors, which we are going to discuss in detail. Now, on a political level, you'll find that, again, we are talking about low budgetary allocation for human resources, low budgetary allocation for for social sector, low budgetary allocation for education and health, low budgetary allocation for skilling people. If they are not able to do this, they can fall in the trap of poverty. Also, you find that it is not just about the government facing a deficit. It can be because of various policies. It can be because of lack of political will, that they do not want to invest in human resource development, that they do not want to invest in healthcare, education, skilling, etc., because of their ideological bias. Similarly, if we do not have sufficient infrastructure, which also comes from political will, because ultimately it is the government who has to invest in education. It is the government who has to invest in health. Because if private players invest in education and health, which are basic necessities, you find that private sector works on the idea of profit. They have to generate more and more profit from any kind of activity or any kind of product that they sell in the market. So for generating that profit, you find that the prices of any kind of public or private services are higher compared to public services, and people would not be able to afford those services. And you see that if you are deprived of the indicator of health, if you're deprived in the indicator of education, you are already multidimensionally poor. Then on a political level, there can be a lot of corruption. Because of this corruption, you might not be getting your, say, the subsidy that was required. Because of this political corruption, they might change the names of families who were in the targeted group. Because of this administrative corruption, you find that there is a lot of backlog when it comes to implementation of various programs and policies, which can ultimately lead, or which can work to the detriment of poor people. Then if your political class doesn't have a sense of responsibility, they would not think about alleviating poverty. They would think about poverty performing a certain function. They would look at poverty from a utilitarian approach, and they would not want to alleviate poverty, because ultimately these poor people are the ones who do not have high awareness levels. So it is very easy to persuade them. It is very easy to manipulate them. So to keep their vote bank consolidated, they might not take up poverty alleviation programs. Then you find lack of public awareness and participation can also lead to poverty, because if we as people, we as members of the civil society, we do not participate in governance, if we are not aware, we do not think of it as our responsibility to take care of our brothers and sisters, it can also lead to impoverishment, because there are various schemes that are running. The governments are not running them transparently. If we do not go out and question them, they will not fix the issue, because those poor people are not aware that it is their right. And if we do not do that, if there is lack of public participation, you find that the governance cannot be considered good. You can find that the government would not be, would not take up responsibility of fixing these issues. Then there is this idea of neo-colonialism. Now it comes from the idea of colonialism, which you already understand. Colonialism says one country taking direct control over another country and taking out resources from there for their own betterment. So this is the parent country, and this is the colony. So what they'll do is they'll rule it directly the way Britishers ruled India. They will create their policies directly. They'll take taxes from people, etc., and use it for their own betterment. They'll use this colony as a mere raw material provider. They'll use this colony as a market to sell their finished products or finished goods, because this is something that you read in your impact of colonialism on on Indian economy. Now the idea of neo-colonialism says that now you do not have a direct control, but they control the erstwhile colonies, or they control the underdeveloping and underdeveloped nations indirectly. That, for instance, they'll put in a lot of money in their economy, and they would ask them to create the policies in favor of their own companies. The idea of crony capitalism. So this idea of crony capitalism can be extended to neo-colonialism. So this neo-colonialism word came into picture because these the countries which colonized Africa, Asia, etc., these great powers like Britain, France, etc., what they did was they left the direct control of those countries, and they took up indirect control of these countries by investing their money in them, by tweaking with their policies. Because ultimately you see that the idea of global corporatism says that ultimately these corporates, ultimately these big companies have an impact on your policies. Your policies are generally designed in the favor of these companies. That's why you see that no matter what government comes in, these big corporates remain the same. Yes, there can be a difference when it comes to the amount of profit that they make, but ultimately it is generally in their favor that the policies are made. Why? Because they are the ones who will provide political funding. They are the ones through whom they can get, or the politicians can make more and more of money. This is what the idea of colonialism is. Now, these were a few political factors which impact or which affect or which cause poverty. Similarly, you have socio-cultural reasons as well. Now, various forms of social discrimination, like discrimination on the basis of caste, can lead to poverty. That people coming from a particular caste group are not allowed to take up certain economic activities. Their occupation is restricted. They cannot change their occupation, even if it is not remunerative, even if they are not able to sustain. But this social discrimination can ultimately lead to poverty. Then you find that if there is poverty, if the people are poor, and we see that the caste system is getting diluted and it is turning into class hierarchy. So if these people come from a lower class, they'll be accorded a lower status, and on the basis of their status, they'll get a role. And the role that they get on the basis of their status is again going to be less remunerative, and they'll be socially discriminated against. They will remain in the same loop or the same cycle of poverty. Then there can be various prejudices on the basis of religion, on the basis of gender. We were talking about feminization of poverty, that women are generally not allowed to work outside the household sphere. There is gender inequality when it comes to, say, opportunities to take up any kind of job or any kind of work, business. Because of these prejudices, you find that people can fall in the trap of poverty, as in the case of women. Now, various causes and consequences of poverty can be understood to be population. If the population is high, they would not be able to provide for their education, they would not be able to provide for their health, etc., which will lead to poverty. And if there is poverty, we see, going by the logic of getting more number of people or more number of hands to contribute to the economic development or to contribute to the economic security of the family, you find that they'll ultimately lead to growing more and more population. Now, because of this population growth, because of poverty and population growth, you find ills like child labor exist. Now, child labor can be understood as a consequence of poverty, because if a household is poor, they would make their children work. Now, if these children work, who's going to school? Who is going to get skilled? No one. So their education levels are going to remain low. If their education levels are low, if the skilling levels are low, they'll not be able to find employment. If they are not able to find employment, they'll remain poor. And if again they are poor, it can lead to child labor, and hence your cycle, vicious cycle, gets completed. Similarly, take example of slums. People living in slums are generally poor. Now, these poor people would not be able to afford health care. These poor people are living in unclean surroundings. These poor people do not have clean drinking water, because of which their health gets impacted. If their health is impacted, if their health gets deteriorated, they would not be able to find a gainful employment. If they do not have an employment, they would not have enough money to spend on a decent home, and they'll end up living in these slums. Hence, the vicious cycle of poverty is completed. Then you think of disintegration of family. So we were saying that the families are getting converted from joint families to nuclear families. One of the important functions of joint family was the economic cooperation. That family was the unit of production, and this joint family, if it disintegrates, and say one of the brothers or one of the family members is not able to get a good employment opportunity, whom do they fall back on? No one, because they do not have this joint family now. They live in a nuclear family, and the entire responsibility, be it economic, be it social, all those responsibilities are on their own shoulders, and they would not be able to cope up with all those responsibilities. So the disintegration of family is also a reason behind poverty. Now, this disintegration of family can also be extended to divorce and separation. If you get divorced, your mental health gets suffered. If you get divorced, the women particularly do not have any opportunity to work. Their family would not accept them, and ultimately, because of this disintegration of family, they will fall in the cycle of poverty. Then, because of poverty, you can have communalism and regionalism, as we have already discussed. But at the same time, Because of communalism and regionalism, you can face problems of poverty. Now, because of, say, any kind of communal conflict, people lose their homes, people lose their jobs, people lose their businesses. Take example of, for the example of Nu or Haryana that was there in the recent past. You find that in these communal conflict, a lot of people had to leave from those areas, and you would have seen mass scale or migration of people. The people who are basically working in different households and earning their income, somehow managing to take care of their family. Now, because of this communal conflict, because they were coming from a minority religion, they were being pushed out of those areas. Now, by the time they settle, because the government is not going to rehabilitate them, because if they wanted to rehabilitate them, they would not have displaced them in the first place. So by the time they get another job, by the time they get another kind of work, they are going to live in dire poverty, dire circumstances. So communalism and regionalism and the conflicts that follow can also lead to poverty, and poverty is a reason behind communalism and regionalism, as already discussed. Yes, Aditya. Now, another factor is we are going to cover this family planning idea. We'll cover it because it is a part of our question as well. If you remember the question that we had left, a little part of the question on population was left. We are going to discuss that and it will be covered here. Do not worry. Now, if a family is poor, they do not have medical facilities. Because of lack of medical facilities, you'll find that the infant mortality rate is high. The maternal mortality rate is high. And if these rates are high, you see that ultimately it can lead to population growth, which can become a burden. Also, these high infant mortality rate and high maternal mortality rate are direct indicators of your multidimensional poverty index, ultimately contributing to poverty. Similarly, these poorer households do not have awareness about family planning. Because of lack of family planning, the birth rates are very high. And if these birth rates are high, you find that it will be a problem for the mother because she is the one who has to bear the child. And we see that pregnancy is sort of a turning point in their lives. If they do not have adequate facilities, they would not be able to cope up with the pregnancy. Similarly, with this high birth rate, you'll have higher population. With this higher population, it will lead to poverty. Then high population growth and poverty, the relationship between these two, they have already asked the question. Let's take it up with question. And we have already discussed indirectly though. Now, because of poverty, child marriage can happen. Because the families would think that we would not be able to, say, take care of the girl or the boy. Let's shift this responsibility on someone else. Now, because of this early child marriage or early marriage or child marriage, the fertility rates will be higher. Ultimately, your birth rates will be higher. And if the birth rates are higher, population growth is high, it leads to poverty. Similarly, it comes to illiteracy, undereducation, which leads to levels of low levels of awareness, particularly in women. They would not understand the idea of family planning. They would not understand the significance of having a smaller family, and ultimately it can lead to poverty. Now you see that all these points are related. One thing is all the dimensions that we have covered, and one dimension is left, we'll cover that. All the dimensions we have covered so far are related. One thing, we do not have to look them in, say, because family planning can also fall under the political bracket. Why? Because the government is not investing time and energy and not carrying out programs for family planning. They are not running any kind of awareness programs. They are not helping people use contraceptives, etc., which can lead to a population growth and hence poverty. So all these dimensions are basically related. Because if we talk about lack of medical facilities, this lack of medical facilities can find their answer in fiscal deficit. These lack of medical facilities can find their answer in lack of political will. This lack of medical facilities can find answer in social sector, etc. So all these dimensions are related. You do not have to keep them in watertight compartments. Now, apart from this, there can be environmental reasons. Now, you think about this. So one, you can think of slum. Second, you can think of highly polluted industrial areas. Now, people who are working as daily wage laborers, they would not be able to afford good housing facility. They would be forced to live in this polluted environment. Just think about this. If you live in the city of Delhi, we know that pollution, we can say that pollution impacts everyone indiscriminately. Pollution has no way of discriminating against people, but people do have shields. If you think of the rich, they'll have their cars, they'll have, say, indoor air filters. They'll take their car, they'll go to the office, they'll stay there in your, say, closed environment, in your air condition. They're not supposed to walk on roads where you have vehicular pollution. They're not supposed to work in industry where you have all sorts of pollution. But when it comes to the poor, they have to travel by bus, they have to walk by feet, because of which they are more vulnerable to the impacts of pollution. They are more vulnerable to any kind of environmental impact. Now, think of environmental impact in terms of climate change. Because of climate change, you will have irregular monsoon. Climate change will directly impact monsoon. Monsoon will directly impact agriculture. And you see that this agriculture, if it is not carried out properly, if it is not productive, if it is not profitable, ultimately people remain poor. Also, even government would have to, say, make some or one or the other arrangement for these people. And you go back to the Doha round, I think you would have discussed in your environment lectures that there is a debate going on between developed and developing countries, wherein the developed countries say that these developing countries are polluting the environment a lot, whereas the developing country says that this climate change, or the stage at which our society is today, the stage at which the environment is today, is all because of your work, is all because of your industrial pollution. And developing countries say that we have a huge population to take care of. The numbers of poverty are very high in our country, and we have to somehow make arrangement for our poor people as well. And we cannot help but pollute environment in that process. So if the agriculture fails, if the agriculture is not profitable, the government would have to open up more of industries to employ these people. They would have to incentivize private sector to open up industries so that employment can be generated. The more the number of industry, it will increase the rate of climate change. Similarly, you find all the other points that people cannot afford to live in clean areas. Those are generally poor people, which impacts their health. And if their health is impacted, they would not be able to earn a decent money. If they are not able to earn decently, they would be forced to live in the same area. This is what your vicious cycles look like. Now, then there are psychological factors. Again, these are generally not considered or covered in paper one, but you have to remember these. You have to understand these, not remember. Why? Because it gives you extra points when you're writing about an answer. So say if there is an all-encompassing question on the causes or the consequences of poverty, you would have to include these as well, even though you give them a slightly less weightage. Now, the psychological effect of poverty is alienation and depression. That these people feel that we are marginalized. Poor people feel that we are not a part of this larger society. Because everywhere you see that there has been skyboxification. So this is an idea, you not have to remember this idea. This is an idea wherein the person says, it is basically a professor from a university. So he says that back in the olden days, your stadiums, your public places were a cultural mixing experience. Why? Because people coming from different races, people coming from different racial backgrounds, people coming from different linguistic backgrounds all stay together in public arena and enjoy, say, a sport or enjoy entertainment or get into a public discourse. But increasingly, as money is playing more and more role in every aspect of our life, you find skyboxification happening. And he gives the example particularly of the skyboxes that you have in your stadiums. So previously, everyone was supposed to sit on benches. Everyone was supposed to get drenched in the rain in a similar fashion, be it rich, be it poor, be it black or white, etc. But now, the ones who can afford, they can get into those sky boxes. There is no cultural mixing experience anymore. Similarly, in case of India, we find that there is no mixing between various classes. Now we are following this class hierarchy. So when it was caste hierarchy, there was no mixing between various castes or people coming from various castes. Now when it comes to classes, there is no mixing between these classes. Either the relationship is of the master and servant, wherein obviously they do not have any kind of interaction apart from the regular day-to-day work. And otherwise, if you go, even if you just think about this, even if you go to your malls to shop, you can say that the rich, the poor, everyone goes to shop in the malls. One idea is that the poor do not go to shop in the malls. And even in these malls, you'll find that the lower the floor is, the more expensive the brand is. So the most expensive brands will find a place on the lower floors. As you go upwards, it starts getting cheaper and cheaper. So you'll find the kind of crowd that you find on lower floors is different from the kind of crowd you find on the upper floor. Yes, you can say that, yes, top floor is always the food court or the PVR. That is different. But I'm talking about your various outlets. Similarly, you find that there is no mixing now. The mixing is very limited, which makes the poor feel that we are not being given opportunities to work. We are not being given opportunities to maintain a decent lifestyle. We are not being given opportunity to mix with other people, which makes them alienated from the society and hence depressed as well. Now, these mental health issues, because these can be consequences of poverty or these can be causes of poverty. If a person is depressed, if there are mental health problems, they would not be able to take up work, ultimately remain poor. And if they are poor, they can face the same process or the same problem of alienation and depression. Then also you find that there is lack of social security when it comes from the government, because the government has a limit to what it can provide for people. That is one idea. So the government does not have ample opportunities of social security. They are not able to take care of social security. And with our transitioning joint family system to nuclear family system and more ideas of individualism, people have this psychological idea in the mind that there is absolutely no one to take care of them, which can also lead them into this curse or this vicious cycle of poverty. Now, related to this is another idea of culture of poverty. So far, we were either saying that the government is not doing enough, or we were talking about the inequalities. Now, the culture of poverty tries to put the blame on the poor themselves. They say it is because these poor people have a different culture, they follow a different culture, they are very short-sighted, that they care only about the existing needs, they only care about the immediate demands, that they are not able to look into the future, do not have futuristic ideas. So rather than spending that money on education, they would end up spending it on their immediate needs of food or housing, etc. So they have a different culture compared to the mainstream. So these poor people follow a different culture compared to the mainstream, which is their own fault. And it is because of this culture of poverty that they follow that they are not able to succeed in life. And this revolves around the idea of merit. How they say, the rich would say, that if I have made it this far in life, it is because of my merit. And if there is someone who's poor and they are not able to earn sufficient, it is their own problem. It is the problem that they have created for themselves. Why not put in efforts? Because in today's world, we say the more efforts you put in, the better quality content you provide, the better answers you write, the more are the chances that you'll make it. So the merit is now considered to be directly proportional to the efforts that an individual puts in. So merit as an idea revolves around the individual. But if I ask you this question, do you think merit of a person is their own making? And I think I have asked you this question. Don't you think there are various socio-economic and political factors which actually play a very important role when it comes to merit? That it is directly proportional, the returns that you get in life is directly proportional to your investment. If you come from a poor family, you can barely make it to higher education. If you're coming from a poor family, you have to drop out after 12th standard to take up some kind of work. You might be the most brilliant person in that group. You might be the one who would have, say, in the future, taken a PhD or doctorate or gone into research. But for the sake of your family, for the immediate needs that are required, you had to drop out of education system. Then how do you think that this merit is a person's own making? Coming back to the idea of culture of poverty, like the idea of merit, culture of poverty tries to put the blame on the poor for their state of poverty. Why? Because they have a different culture. They do not look into the future. They are not futuristic. But you have to ask a question that if a person, they are suffering from malnutrition, their immediate need is food, how do you think they'll be able to spend on education? How do you think they'll think at all about education? And also, you might say that why did they give birth to so many children? But what about awareness programs? Do you think your awareness programs, etc., would reach them? Do you think they would be able to comprehend ideas as complex as you are reading for civil services? No, they are not. So, yes, you can say that there is this idea of culture of poverty, but understand we do not have to put the blame on the victim. It is equivalent to asking a rape victim that why did you go out? That is what putting the blame on the victim. And that is something we do not have to do. So we have to understand this idea of culture of poverty, but we do not have to get swayed away by it. We have to be logical, we have to be rational. Okay, so these were various causes and consequences of poverty, and we saw that there is a direct relationship between the causes and how it extends to the consequences of poverty. That lack of, say, educational facilities can be a cause of poverty. Similarly, this lack of educational opportunities can also be a consequence of poverty, right? So I hope you have understood this in the light of vicious cycle that we had discussed. Now, what we'll do is we'll take up a few questions that have been asked in the past. And apart from these questions, we are going to look into a couple of more themes. So I think I have covered those themes previously, but I have kept everything in one place for you to understand. Okay, let's look at this question. Critically examine whether growing population is the cause of poverty or poverty is the cause of population increase in India. Now, if you remember, we had, say, taken out 4 dimensions from here, that how population growth can lead to poverty, how population growth won't always lead to poverty. Similarly, how poverty leads to population growth and how poverty need not necessarily lead to population growth. So I think we had discussed these ideas, and the only idea that was left was how population growth would lead to poverty. And you have seen through the vicious cycle. Now you get it. Yes, great. So Sneha is saying that it can be a vicious cycle. And as explained yesterday in the introduction part, you can draw a vicious cycle between population growth and poverty. I hope you are getting your answer. That now you'll be in a position to draw this vicious cycle between population growth and poverty. That is what the essence of the question is. But in the body part, we're going to address these 4 components. These 4 components have been discussed, and now you already know what a vicious cycle has to look like. So Aditya says growing population overburdens the resources. Lack of resources make people poor. Then there is poverty, there is lack of awareness, which will lead to increased birth rate and ultimately more population. And if you remember, we were saying that we have to take up all these dimensions in the body part, we have to draw this vicious cycle, and then we had discussed the conclusion yesterday as well. So I hope this question is clear now. And that's what I was talking about, that you have to understand the vicious cycle between population growth and poverty. So if you draw that vicious cycle, that is basically the essence of this question. And then you have to expand on these points to show the evaluator that you have the understanding, you have the conceptual depth of understanding this problem as the complex problem of poverty. Because generally, when you think of poverty, we think that okay, it is general problem, there are government schemes, etc., which can take care of this. But we find that poverty is a multidimensional phenomena. The causes of poverty range from sociological, or from social, psychological, political, etc. So if we want to target poverty, we have to look into each and every dimension, and that's how you say that poverty is a multidimensional phenomena. And related to that, we have already discussed multidimensional poverty index. Now let's look at a few other considerations. Poverty and caste and class. So we have already discussed this relationship between poverty and caste. So you find, and now this is a slightly older data, you find that it is generally your so-called lower caste where you find most of the incidence of poverty. So look at this. If you look in the general population, it is 13.7% in urban areas, whereas in your socially and educationally backward castes, you find it to be very high. Similarly, if you go to rural areas, it is as high as 45% in scheduled tribes. It is as high as 31% in scheduled castes. Whereas you find that in the general population, it is not that high. So when we say try to argue against the idea of reservation, we have to bring in, or we have to think about the relationship between poverty and caste. Similarly, there is a relationship between poverty and class. So your poverty levels also depend on what kind of work you take up. Now, this is a fairly simple thing because you see that there is a direct relationship between class and poverty. Because if you're coming from a low class, the chances are that you will be in that bracket of poverty. But again, it gives you a comparison between agricultural laborers, between people who are, say, salaried or who are working on daily wages, etc., that there is a relationship between your class and poverty. Now, we have also discussed this idea of poverty and crime. So we were saying that poverty can have a direct relationship with economic crimes, but poverty, the relationship between poverty and crime or violent crimes in particular, or crimes in general, cannot be established. Because generally you see that poverty is on a decline in each and every country. Take case of India, poverty is on a decline. We have just looked at your multidimensional poverty index. But at the same time, you find that the crime rates have always been on a rise. Now, it can owe to the fact that there is a base effect, the population is increasing, that's why crime rates are increasing. But also, you take up example of your rural areas. Now we find, looking at the numbers, that the extent of poverty in rural areas is more compared to urban areas. But when it comes to even economic crimes, rural areas do not find more economic crimes. It is generally your urban areas where you'll find more number of economic crimes. So the relationship between poverty and crime, we have seen that yes, they can be directly proportional at times, but this relationship cannot always be established. It will differ from society to society. Plus, we have a lack of evidence on this idea. But generally, we see that it is very easy to relate poverty and crime because we think that these section of people are deprived and they would do whatever they want. But if they were to cross the line, if the poor people were to cross the line, who are more in number compared to the rich who are very few in number, if they were to cross the line, don't you think they would have taken them over by now? the idea of your revolution that Marx had propounded. But it doesn't happen. Why? Because there is the government machinery, there is a mechanism for providing justice, and then you have police and administration who takes care of this. And also, it does not, you cannot directly question intention of people on the basis of their class. You cannot say that if it is if they are poor, their intention would be to steal it from others, right? So you cannot establish a direct relationship between poverty and crime. Then when it comes to poverty, you'll find that when you move from one state to another, there will be regional differences. So we find that there are few states where you have more number of poor people. Then you find that there are regional differences in terms of urban and rural India. We have already looked at the numbers today while going through multidimensional poverty index. Now with this, one thing becomes important, that is your urban and rural divide. Now the causes of urban poverty have been understood by us. Now let's look specifically at the relationship between poverty and rural India. Now when you say rural, the first idea that comes to your mind is agriculture. But even in agriculture, you'll find there can be farmers who have small land holdings. There can be farmers who have large land holdings. Then there can be landless laborers as well. Also, when it comes to rural areas, another economic activity can be the allied economic activities. So any kind of primary activity can be directly related to rural areas, to rural India. Now, if you take the case of rural India, you see that India has been an agrarian economy. Even today, we find most of our population is engaged in agriculture, even though the contribution of agriculture to the GDP has reduced. Now it is the service sector which contributes the most. But yes, India is still considered to be an agrarian economy for the fact that most of our people or most of our population is engaged in agriculture. But you find that the land holdings are small. The reason is, one is traditionally because of the caste divide, that land holdings are small. Second, you find that with nuclearization of family, the land holdings become smaller. Then you have government intervention in the form of land ceiling, etc., which also contributes directly to small land holdings. I hope you remember this because this is something that we have already discussed with the concept of family. So people have small land holdings. So generally they rely on subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture means that whatever they produce, they consume it themselves. But again, there can be people who are involved in cash crops. But also you'll find that they can grow just enough to take care of their basic needs. So whatever crops they grow, whatever produce they have, they'll sell it in the market and they'll just get sufficient money to take care of their basic needs. There won't be any surplus. To the extent that even when it comes to buying the seeds and the raw material for the next crop, they would have to depend on a money lender because generally they would not get any kind of credit from institutional facilities. So they have to rely on the money lenders who charge very high interest rates, which also becomes a reason for their impoverishment. Then in rural India, you'll have landless laborers who do not have any land. They work on someone else's land for very low wages or maybe a share in the crop. But at times you find that the crops fail as well. Now, failure of crop, say on a small piece of land, would not be a problem for a big farmer, but it will definitely be a problem for the landless laborers who are working there on sharing basis. Now, again, there can be multiple types of arrangement when it comes to landless laborers. They can work on daily wages, they can work on, say, profit sharing basis, etc. Then the rate of population growth is high in rural areas. You see that your fertility rate is higher compared to urban areas in rural areas. Now, with this high rate of population growth, the levels of literacy are still low. So you can see that this high growth rate in population is also a factor of low levels of literacy. And also, if you couple this high population growth with low levels of literacy, you are also again going to lead to poverty. Then you find that when it comes to industrial and service sectors, now forget about service sector. Why? Because service sector requires highly skilled labor. Service sector requires highly skilled labor. So anyways, these farmers, these peasants with no skills whatsoever would not be able to get absorbed in the service sector. But yes, they can get absorbed in the industrial sector in skilled, in unskilled and semi-skilled labor. But again, you find that the pace of development of particularly industrial sector is not very high. Because of which they are not able to generate a lot of employment. They are not able to generate or to absorb labor from the agricultural sector. Why? Because agricultural productivity has been going down over the years. So these non-farm sectors are not able to absorb excess labor from the farm sector. Now the trickle-down effect, in the case of development, you read trickle-down or you understand trickle-down effect, has remained confined to urban areas. And that's where you find that it is the urban areas where you'll have job creation. It is the urban areas where the levels of poverty are low. But rural areas have still not benefited a lot from the overall development of the society. Then also the other form of activity or economic activity in rural India can be, say, basic cottage industry, your artisans working or making pots, etc. So now your modernized factory equipments have made that sector redundant, and it is not something new. This had happened back in the British era, and you read it as, or you understand it as, deindustrialization of Indian economy. That the local economy that was there was being completely destroyed by your, say, modern technology. With the advent of industrial phase, or with the start of industrial phase, you find that these bigger companies with bigger, with huge resources, they took over and they destroyed the Indian market completely. And you know that. And I think we have discussed this in context of globalization as well. As impact of globalization, we see that your number of MNCs in a country or in region grows, and now these MNCs with their huge resources uh, throw others out of business. That's what happens. That is what deindustrialization meant. Now we see that in rural areas, the primary activity was agriculture. Now this agriculture is no more productive. This agriculture is no more profitable. Apart from that, there were other simpler jobs like work of artisan, because we were saying that there were caste-based groups who used to take up their own particular activity. And even today, you'll find that a person coming from the caste of potters, they're generally involved in pottery. Similarly, people coming from the caste group of barbers, they're still involved in that activity. But these are the ones, these are activities, or these are a few works which are still important, which are still prevalent in the society. So they do not face that issue much. But think about other artisan works. Think about people who used to, say, weave clothes with hands, your tribals, your various other caste groups. Now, those handmade articles are out of business because they are expensive. They are not as refined as your machine-made goods. So they are out of business. And we are saying that your industrial and your service sector is not able to absorb the excess labor from agriculture. And that's where you find a lot of disguised unemployment in agriculture. I think you would have read that in your paper 3 discussion, in your economy subject, because there you cover unemployment and we talk about disguised unemployment. So there can be seasonal, disguised, etc. forms of unemployment. Trickle down means, so they say, if you, so this is society, say, so they say, if you basically start investing on the top, or if you basically start creating industries, etc., if there is development on an upper level, it will ultimately trickle down to the bottom. That rather than going with bottom-up approach, it is better to follow the trickle-down approach. that let's invest a lot of money in service sector. The service sector will create employment, and that effect will trickle down to the bottom of the society. That is what trickle down effect means. If high poverty in rural areas leads to less agricultural production, it leads to demand for raw material for factories, not available raw material, factory closed, it leads to urban poverty also. Yes, it is true. So Balaraj is saying that if agriculture now is not productive, and agriculture is responsible for providing raw material to various industry, now if these industries with say low supply of raw material, the cost of this raw material goes higher. If the cost of this raw material is high, the final product or the final commodity becomes more expensive. Their price also goes high. And now you'll find that they would not be able to sustain in the market with such higher prices, because there can be MNCs who will take over this, because the MNCs can provide the same product. They might sell it at a loss, but they can go on taking that loss for years altogether. So they start providing this product at a cheaper cost, and they will ruin this business. If they ruin this business, they basically kill all the people who are employed in this industry. And not just these, they kill the people who were there through the supply chain, because to take your raw material from one place to another needs people, needs logistic support. So not just that the industry itself is destroyed, it will destroy the supply chains. It will ultimately also destroy, or it will ultimately also dent agriculture more. So which can lead to urban poverty. Absolutely yes. So we're talking about inability of non-farm sectors. So we are saying non-farm sectors are which ones? Industrial and service sectors. So we were saying that the growth of industrial and service sectors in India has not been great. And also these industrial and service sectors were not able to absorb this excess labor from agriculture. How? That we said that service sector needs highly skilled labor, and also with more and more of modernization, with more and more of automation, with more and more role of technology increasing, the industries also employ a lot less people compared to before. So that's why one is their slow growth, second is their inability to absorb excess labor from non-farm sectors. So I hope all these ideas are clear. Inflation is high. Yes, okay. So you are talking about this cycle. Yeah. So we are not going much into the economic details. I just explained it for the sake of it. They would not ask a question about these finer aspects, because these basically fall in the domain of paper 3. Now, on the basis of this, you have other two considerations that you have to keep in mind. Now, we say poverty is also an outcome of economic development. What do you think about it? So if I say that poverty is also an outcome of economic development, there are two ideas: that yes, it is, no, it is not. So you have to answer both these aspects. Now, this is something that you have to take up on your own. I'll be there only to assist you. So the ones who have not been contributing to the discussion, now is the time, because this is something we have discussed a little. All you have to do is to expand on it. That's it. So there can be two ideas related to the statement, that yes, poverty is also an outcome of economic development, and also no, poverty is not an outcome of economic development. So to answer your no, let me tell you this, that once any economy develops, they'll create more employment opportunities. Once any economic develops, they'll give more money in taxes to the government. Now the government can invest that money in social sector. This government can invest that money in poverty alleviation programs. So your economic development, it looks like that no, it would not lead to poverty. It will rather alleviate poverty, right? But how about the idea that poverty or economic development leads to poverty? How do you explain that? So yes, CN is saying that with economic development, there'll be a rise in technology and they'll kill employment. Ragini is saying economic development needs a particular skill set which everyone doesn't hold. So Ragini is saying that with economic development, you'll have more specialized roles. And not everyone will be able to take up these specialized roles, because not everyone is educated, not everyone is skilled in these roles. What else? Yes, so lack of skilled labor. Sneha, this is done. What else? I have given that idea to you a couple of slides ago. How about, so if you think of economic development, the economic development will raise the standard of living of people. If you raise the standard of living of people, the cost of living also goes up. If the cost of living goes up, people would not be able to afford decent healthcare. People would not be able to afford basic housing facilities. With economic development, small sectors cannot compete. So, great. Aditya is saying, with economic development, you find that you'll have more and more MNCs. The market share of these companies will expand. But while the market share of these companies expand, your smaller industries, your cottage industries, etc., will fail. If the cottage industry fails, where do these laborers go? Why? Because these modern industries work on automation. These modern industries need highly specialized skills. And again, they would not be able to absorb this thing. But also, you find that this economic development also creates new roles or new jobs. The way we were talking about gig economy. If not for economic development, if not for the growth of service sector, you would not have this gig economy in place, because you would not have people working at night. You would not have people requiring these cab services. So economic development can create new employment as well. And not just new employment, they can create newer roles. It can give government more power, more economic, strength to the government to invest in social sector schemes, social welfare schemes. Great. So now Vishal has taken up the environmental dimension. He says that with economic growth, we are going to destroy our environment. If we destroy our environment, ultimately, there'll be there'll be a group of people who will be more vulnerable to these environmental impacts. So the environmental pollution created by industry is impacting your poor farmers. Similarly, these environmental impacts are actually creating problems related to your health, making people less productive and hence poor. No, great. Now this is the kind of discourse that we need to have. So CN is saying that we can say no, that it is not an outcome of economic development. Why? Because they are going to provide new technology for agriculture. If you provide new technology for agriculture, agriculture will become more productive. If it becomes more productive, then we alleviate poverty. Great. So again, Balaraju is saying that because of economic development, you find there'll be economic inequality as well. Sneha is talking about the idea of capitalism. So capitalism basically relies on market. So it talks about the invisible hand that is of market, and it lets market decides prices, etc. Now if market decides price, market will decide the prices on the basis of supply and demand. Market has different norms. So yes, because of capitalism, because of growth of newer industries, there'll be competition, which is economic competition, which is healthy for the economic development of country. You'll get products at a cheaper price. But at the same time, because of this role of market and diminishing role of the state, there'll be few commodities every now and then which might be very basic, which will become unaffordable, like your vegetable, like your pulses. So because of this inflation, because of this rise in price, because of, say, your contractual farming, because of your middlemen and black marketing practices, you find that pulses, etc., or any nutritious food has become unaffordable for the poor. If they are not able to afford nutritious food, they'll fall sick more often. They'll not be able to take care of their health. If the health is not fine, they would be less productive. If the health is not fine, they would not be able to go to school. And ultimately, they'll remain poor. Aditya is saying technology can take place of laborers, making them less effective, causing labor devaluation. Yes, that idea has been discussed. That was the first idea we discussed when we said yes. With rising automation, rising levels of automation, with artificial intelligence, recently it was in the news, if you have read the newspaper, that because of artificial intelligence, a lot of your content creators, etc., are losing their jobs. Why? Because with the help of artificial intelligence, the work of 10 people can be taken up by only one person, because they just have to sit and review. Rest, everything would be taken care of by your artificial intelligence, thereby taking away jobs from people. Now, those people who were skilled in that particular skill set. So, this problem of unemployment is not just limited to your unskilled labor, it also extends to your skilled labor. So, the people who have been working in this field of content creation for, say, 5, 7, 10 years, they have only that skill set. If they have only that skill set, and every company is saying that we do not need this skill set, what else do they do? Else they take up a new course, learn something else, and you know that it is not always possible to switch careers at any stage of your life. Yes, it sounds good, it sounds very fancy when there is a motivational speaker speaking about the same on YouTube. Yes, it sounds very fancy, it sounds very nice. It is very, say, and it instills the spirit of enthusiasm in you. But it is not always practically possible, because people have bills to pay, people have family members to take care of. So the layoffs, etc., that happen in IT industry every now and then, it becomes a menace. It creates a lot of problems within those families. It also becomes a reason behind a lot of broken marriages. So how economy can impact anything for that matter. Okay, so now I see that you have understood this idea of how to approach anything, because the points that you have given are not important, but the way in which you have approached is important. That you take up one statement, you look at both the facets, you take up all the dimensions, environmental, economic, political, etc., and you reach your answer. That's how you have to do it. Because the questions that they ask are generally very new. Look at this question that we have just discussed. Critically examine this, this, this. So the first time you would have seen this in the examination, yes, you would have understood this is vicious cycle, but you would not have understood this. This understanding is created by your conceptual clarity. Economic development can lead to individualism, can cause alienation to depression, to mental health problem. Because of that mental health problem, you would not get employment, and ultimately you'll stay poor. Okay, so you have understood this idea of poverty, how poverty can be understood to be an outcome of economic development. And if you remember, yesterday I'd asked you this question, that when you try answering poverty alleviation and development, we generally have similar answers. And now you understand, yes, the answer is similar, but the way you approach it has to be different. Both have different ideas behind them. Okay, so this is basically called development paradox, because generally it is understood that economic development will lead to alleviation of poverty, but it can also work for the detriment of people, of poorer people. Okay, another idea is urban poverty in India is an overflow of rural poverty. Now, looking at this statement, you'll again say there are two ideas, that yes, urban poverty is an overflow of rural poverty. Then also you can say no, urban poverty is not an overflow of rural poverty. Now, what we'll do is, we're not going to discuss this here. You have to consider this as a question for practice. This is your practice question, because you have 5 days before we get to our next session. I have given you practice questions in previous chapters as well that you have to try writing. Let's leave this question raw. Let's leave this idea as it is. What you have to do is take it up as a practice question and try to answer this. Try to create this framework, that how can you say that urban poverty is an overflow of rural poverty. Okay, so Sneha, I'm not going to disclose your answer, because this is an exercise that you have to take up yourself. Okay, let's move on to our next question, which talks about we were saying that there have been multiple elevation programs, etc., but we have not been able to eradicate poverty. What is the reason behind that? So despite implementation, remember the word implementation, of various programs for eradication of poverty by Government of India, poverty still exists. Explain by giving reasons. Now, the first thing you have to do is you think about this question. The first idea is that the government has various programs for poverty eradication, but because of issues related to implementation, poverty still exists. But also, you know that it cannot only be about implementation. If the data is not proper, you would not get the right design of the policy. So it need not only be an issue of implementation of policy, but it can also be about design of the policy as well. But yes, they have asked a question on this part, that is implementation. But you can just give them a glimpse in the introduction that it need not only be because of issues related to implementation, but this can also come from design. And you can just give an example that if the data that is used, if at times we use sample survey data, and because of that data we would not be able to identify the target groups properly, the issue related to census, right, we had discussed yesterday. And hence, if the design is not right, no matter how better you implement it, it is not going to yield any result. That is one idea about the problems related to design and implementation of various programs. If you do not know the points about implementation, yes, you would know basic points about implementation, leakages, etc. What we'll do is, when we take up the last chapter on implementation, we'll cover it in detail again. But yes, for this question, you'll have sufficient data, because this is not the only point that you have to cover. Because you know that yes, government is trying to alleviate poverty, but there are multiple factors which impact poverty, and government cannot target every factor. So what you have to do is, in the answer, you have to talk about that yes, poverty can poverty can arise out of various other factors like population growth, inadequate access to resources, etc. Also, issues related to design and implementation of various poverty alleviation policies also stand in way of eliminating poverty from India. So you have to tell them that it is not just limited to the problems of implementation when it comes to various government policies and programs, but it can also be because of design and other factors. Because population growth, yes, government can target it. They can come with, say, one child, two child policy. They can come up with family planning measures, etc. But again, you find that there is a natural tendency of the population to grow. The population growth will always remain positive. The population will keep on growing, which also contributes to poverty. Because government cannot say that let's reduce the population, right? The government cannot increase the death rates for that matter. Yes, they can control at the level of birth rates, but ultimately the population is bound to grow. Also, government cannot ask the rich to give away their resources to the poor. So yes, there is going to be this problem related to inadequate access of resources. So tell them that yes, it can be because of issues related to design and implementation. But again, you find that there are other factors which also impact your poverty. So Aditya is asking why the government is not implementing two-child policy. Aditya, if you look at the fertility rate, it is 2.1, and we need at least 2.1, which is equivalent, more or less equivalent to two-child policy, right? Yes, you can suggest, Vishal, but this question is more about finding out the issues related to design and implementation. And in suggestion, it is better you stick to the implementation part. You stick to various issues related to implementation. Design, yes, you can give them a glimpse of it. And also, what you have to do is just look at these points for now. What we'll do is, when we discuss design and implementation related problems, we are going to take it up in detail. We are going to break it down in various points. We'll create a flow and we'll help you with that. So for now, what you can do is to, if you try to write this answer, you have the little answer here. Okay. Moving on to the next question. The next question says that an essential condition to eradicate poverty is to liberate the poor from process of deprivation. Substantiate the statement with suitable example. Now, to eradicate poverty, what can we do? We can break the vicious cycle. There is a vicious cycle which needs to be broken, which the government can, which the civil society can. But what is this process of deprivation? Can anyone suggest? What is the process of deprivation? So Aditya, when it comes to various vulnerable sections, I have already provided links for a few vulnerable sections. And also, if you want all the policies and programs in one page, you have to wait till prelims, because you'll get those documents on government policies, programs, international organizations separately. Right now, you need not worry about that. Can anyone suggest what is this process of deprivation? Process of deprivation, not eradication. Absolute poverty is not process of deprivation. Now think about it. If when they are talking about a process, the only process that you have read about poverty is this vicious cycle. They're basically asking you, how can you break this vicious cycle to eradicate poverty? How can you break this vicious cycle to eradicate poverty? So what you have to do in this answer is, you not need to create multiple vicious cycles. You have to consider all the factors affecting poverty, or all the causes of poverty, and give them a glimpse of how it becomes a process of deprivation, and how, if you liberate them from this process of deprivation, you can eradicate poverty. So you can say that if you think of a poorer household, they do not have educational facilities, they have poor literacy rates, because of which they are not able to find employment, etc., and which ultimately leads to poverty. So you understand the vicious cycle. So what you can say is, this process of deprivation, that they have a deprivation of resources when it comes to education, if the government enters at that stage, they can basically break this vicious cycle. So all you have to do is, yes, by educating them, by giving them training, etc., unequal opportunity and access to resources, yes, absolutely, this is what the essence of the question is. This is what the process of deprivation is. So you have to primarily talk about how you can break the vicious cycle to eradicate poverty from the society. Now, what you have to do is, you have to look at these questions just while revising. I know that today it has been too much, because yesterday also you would not have got time after the class to revise, but you have 5 more days to revise before we have our next session. So what you have to do is, keep reading on a regular basis, keep writing on a regular basis to improve on your skills. Now, your next point is, or your next part is hunger. So if you look at paper 2 syllabus, it talks about issues related to poverty and hunger. So poverty has been covered with paper 1 topic. We have discussed all the questions that have been that you find in the previous year papers. Now we have to move towards hunger. So Balaraju is asking, can giving money to poorer households can help them alleviate poverty? Now see, there is one limitation when it comes to handing out money. So if you have read that conspicuous consumption that happens in poorer households, that there is this idea that if you give them money, they would not use it in adequate manner because of their low levels of awareness. They'll think of their immediate needs, because you see that what happens when you give them money, you have a lot of cases of domestic violence. Why? Because that money is being used by the male members of the family to drink alcohol, which leads to domestic violence. But ultimately, the idea is that the money is not used properly. But yes, now you see that there are direct benefit transfer schemes, etc. But ultimately, it is better to look into the multidimensional aspect of poverty, to target through education, to target through health, to target through skilling, rather than handing out money. So yes, if they do not have adequate nutrition, supply them with food rather than sending them money. Because even in case of food, and you would have seen this, when it comes to the drawbacks of your Food Security Act and the issues related to implementation of your Food Security Act, you find that these households will get those grains and they'll sell it in the open market. You would have seen that uh, poorer people are, say, rehabilitated in a particular region. What they'll do is they'll just rent it out to other people and take that money. So ultimately, whatever is meant for them is not being used by them. But this issue of misuse can happen in any case, for that matter. But generally, you see that when you hand out money, it becomes problematic. There are more chances. There are more chances of it being misused. And then, apart from absolute and relative poverty, there is another form of poverty which talks about this conspicuous consumption. They say that the people are there above poverty line, but because of bad habits like drinking, gambling, etc., they fall below the poverty line. That is another, say, type of poverty that need not remember here because they would not ask about it. But yes, this is also another form of poverty, that they have the money, they are staying above poverty line, but because of their bad habits, they fall below poverty line. Because if they get into consuming alcohol, they would not go out for work and they will lose their job. So if they lose their job, they will fall below the poverty line. Then also you find that expenses on health, education, etc., any kind of natural disaster, any kind of right or communal issue can also push people below poverty line. So think about the migrants. Think about people who got displaced during this communal conflict in Haryana. Think about people who got displaced during this communal conflict in Manipur. Think about your migrant laborers, what happened to them during your COVID lockdown. So there are multiple ways in which a person or a family can be pushed below poverty line. Why? Because they would not have any savings, they would not have any surplus. And that's why bank account as an indicator of poverty has been mentioned there. That is what I meant. Uh, okay, yes, Neha. Huh. So let's do one thing. Let's take a break and start with a topic on hunger after the break. So let's meet again at 7:15, and then we'll have enough time to prepare the background for hunger, to understand the idea of hunger. What is hunger? Some of you might feel that the way you are feeling hungry right now is hunger, but it is more than that. We will discuss the idea of hunger after the break, and we'll try to prepare the basic background of hunger, and rest can be covered in our next session. Okay, so let's meet at 7:15 after the break. Welcome back, everyone. So, we have discussed everything related to poverty. Now, hunger is another chapter that we have to discuss. Now, you see that hunger is also related to poverty for that matter. But when we start discussing hunger, that we are going to, will understand hunger, what are the manifestations when it comes to hunger, etc., you'll find that there is divergence. What does that mean? So, we are saying that hunger and poverty are directly related. That you can also say, saying that if a person doesn't have sufficient income, if they do not have sufficient money, they would not be able to afford nutrition. They would not be able to afford food. That can lead to hunger. But there is divergence as well. Has anyone here gone through the recent newspaper which talks about your global hunger index? Anyone here who has gone through the newspaper wherein the global hunger index was in news? Yes, so India has been ranked 111 out of 125 countries. So we see that in global hunger index, every year India's ranking, either it is remaining more or less same, because again every year there are different number of countries. So out of those countries, either the India of rank of India is going down, or it more or less remains the same. But when we just discussed about poverty, and particularly multidimensional poverty index, we were saying that there has been a decline in poverty over the years. And you might be surprised looking at this data, saying that how can poverty be on a decline and hunger on a rise? So poverty is on a decline and hunger is on a rise. What is this divergence between these two ideas? What is this divergence when it comes to these numbers? And this is also something that we have to think about. Keep thinking about it. By the time we finish hunger, we are going to answer this question and a similar question, and rather a question on this very phenomena has been asked. That how is it that the levels of poverty are going down in India, but the levels of hunger are going up? What is this divergence between poverty and hunger? And you will understand this when we look into various factors that can cause hunger. Now, this is India's ranking when it comes to a global hunger index 22. Yes, you can also, if you look at this, the rank was 107 in the past year. Every year in the month of October, this global hunger index comes out. And this year, India's rank has been 111. And if you look at this GHI score, we see that India was doing better every year. So from 38.8 in 2000, in the year 2000, it came down to 28.2. But now, in the past year, we find that the global, the GHI score or the global hunger index score has gone up. That means the level of hunger has increased in case of India. Because as we move from 0 to 50, these are various stages. And we see that as we move from 0 to 50, the condition keeps getting poor. We will come back to global hunger index because there are problems with global hunger index. Whether we accept the data, reject the data, we will take those decisions. Now let's look at this graph as well. It compares the data of stunting, wasting, and underweight from NFHS 3 and NFHS 4. And also, when you look at NFHS 5 data, you still find that there are a lot of children in India who still face stunting, wasting, and underweight, because these are direct indications of malnutrition. When we think of malnutrition, basically it is deficiency of nutrition in body, and that deficiency of nutrition can lead to these phenomena. And we will come to these as well. Now, if you think of stunting, it is having a short height for your age. When you think of wasting, it is having low weight for your height. And then when it comes to underweight, it is low weight according to your age. And also, please remember that you have to remember these. What is stunting, what is wasting, what is underweight? Because they have already asked a question in prelims. So please remember this, because anyways, we are going to cover this, discuss these things, these aspects in this discussion. But also you have to look into a few things here. That what are the overall trends when it comes to various phenomena. So if you try to compare the data, in these three dimensions, that is stunting, wasting, and underweight, you'll find when it comes to stunting and underweight, there has been a decline. So from 48, stunting has come down to 38.4. According to your NFHS 5 data, it has come down to 35.5. So there is a decline. When you think about the percentage of children who are underweight, it has also gone down to 35.7. And in through NFHS 5 data, you find that it is 32.1. Then again, a decline. But now when it comes to wasting, wasting is what? Wasting is having low weight for your height. When you think of wasting, if you look at the number from your NFHS 3 data, that is to 2005 and 6, you find that it was 19.8, but it increased to 21 in year 2015-16. And now if you look at the data from NFHS 5, that is 2019-21, you find it to be 19.3. So now there is a decline. But between these 2 years, between 2005 and 15, the number of children who were wasted had increased. And again, if you look at these numbers, don't you think it paints a rather grim picture of the state of nutrition in our country? Because stunting, wasting, and underweight, they do not only depend on nutrition, but one of the major factor is nutrition. So 38.4% of the children were stunted. Similarly, 21% of the children were wasted, and 35% children were underweight. Look at the proportion, look at the numbers. If you convert it in absolute numbers, it is going to be a huge number that we cannot think about. Now, when we start thinking about hunger, so you see, hunger is directly related to food, that you know. Hunger, again, basically is a sensation that we feel that we want to eat something. Don't you say that, mother or father, I'm feeling hungry, I need something to eat. That is the sensation, the signal of the body that you need some food, that you need something to eat, is the idea of hunger. But is it this sensation that they are talking about? The answer is no. Then there is another phenomena of malnutrition, wherein there is improper nutrition balance in the body. That the body is not getting the nutrition that it needs. It is not getting the essential macronutrients or your micronutrients. This is what malnutrition. Now, if this malnutrition goes on for a longer duration of time, it becomes starvation. That it becomes severe deficiency of vitamins, nutrients, and energy intake. It is the most extreme form of malnutrition. So if this malnutrition goes on for, say, weeks and months, it will convert into starvation. Now, with starvation, you see that, and you already know that a person can ultimately die. The starvation can lead to multiple organ failure. People would not be able to function. Their organs would not be able to function. They can get permanently destroyed. Now, when you think of hunger, you think of malnutrition. That is what the idea is. Starvation, again, is a form of malnutrition, but is the most extreme form of malnutrition. That your essential vitamins, nutrients, etc. are deficient in your body and are severely deficient in your body. That is what the idea of starvation is. So when you think of hunger, please think of malnutrition. That it is actually malnutrition that they are talking about. So even in global hunger index, you'll find these factors play a role. And these are basically various manifestations of malnutrition in someone's body. If you do not get sufficient nutrition, you might have a short height for your age. If you do not get sufficient nutrition, you might have a lower weight for your age. These are basically manifestations of malnutrition. Now, if you look at WHO's data, that every year, more than 1 billion people, that is basically 6 people, 1 out of 6 people in the world, are currently affected by the most extreme form of malnutrition. 1/6 of the global population. Just think about the number. Because yes, we are very busy thinking about economic development, growth, etc. But we see, look at the situation, be it global or be it your national situation. And we talk about, yes, we definitely talk about becoming superpowers in the future. And a few have already claimed India to be superpower. But you look at the numbers when it comes to malnutrition, you look at the numbers when it comes to poverty, and we see that it is not that simple to achieve the rate of development, to achieve the basic facilities for your entire population. It is still a far-fetched idea. So when you think of malnutrition, it can manifest in two ways primarily. One is undernutrition and the other one is overnutrition. Take example. Now, if a person is not getting sufficient food, they would not be able to derive sufficient nutrition from that food, because of which they can suffer undernutrition. Now, there is a possibility that a person gets sufficient food. They are getting their calorie intake that is desirable, say 2000 calories per day, they are getting that calorie, but that food is not rich in nutrition. It is junk food. That food doesn't contain all the macro and micronutrients required for the body. It will lead to overnutrition. And you find this problem of overnutrition in obesity. So people who are obese, basically, it is because of lack of physical activity, but also you find that, yes, they are consuming sufficient calories and maybe more than the calories that are required to maintain their body, but ultimately they're not getting any nutrition from that food. So one idea is that the food is not nutritious, and the other idea is that your body has some or the other deficiency or some or the other health problem, because of which your body is not able to absorb that nutrition. So for example, one of the newest lifestyle disease is deficiency of vitamin D. But if you have deficiency of vitamin D, your body would not be able to process the proteins that you consume. So yes, you might be having a perfectly balanced diet, but you would not be able to derive nutrition out of it, which can also lead to overnutrition. Now let's look at the causes of malnutrition, and this is where you get your answer for the divergence. So one idea is a person is not getting sufficient food. Say they require 2000 kilocalories every day to maintain their weight, to maintain their body, but they are not able to obtain that much amount. Now this caloric deficiency can happen because of fasting. This caloric deficiency can happen because a person is not able to afford food. This caloric deficiency can happen because a person lives in a remote area and they do not have sufficient to eat there. So there can be multiple factors behind this caloric deficiency. But please remember, it is not fasting or it is not deliberate fasting that we are talking about. We're talking about this caloric deficiency that happens because of poverty, because that's how we establish the relationship. Then another idea is, or the another cause is micronutrient deficiency, which is now termed as hidden hunger. And now this hidden hunger is the most important form today. That yes, we might be taking proper, say, macronutrients. We might be deriving proper macronutrients from our food, but your micronutrients like vitamins, minerals, which you generally obtain from various vegetables and fruits, if you're not able to obtain those, if there is a deficiency of those micronutrients, it is called hidden hunger. Now, again, this is also a factor, a direct factor of poverty. Why? Because your vegetables, your fruits are very expensive, and not everyone is able to afford those kind of foods. So they'll naturally have this micronutrient deficiency in their body. Now, also, we were saying that the other factor can be anything related to health. Now, not having safe drinking water can deteriorate health. Not having access to proper sanitation facilities, particularly toilets, can also be detrimental to your health. And if your health is not proper, if your body is not functioning properly, no matter what you eat, you're not going to absorb any nutrition out of it. Then also, low levels of immunization also impact health directly. So you see that there are three factors which relate to health, and then there are two causes which relate directly to deficiency of various nutrients in your body. So this malnutrition can manifest as both undernutrition and overnutrition. I hope the ideas are clear. And this malnutrition can be caused because of caloric deficiency, can happen because of micronutrient deficiency, but can also happen because of poor access to drinking water, poor access to, say, sanitation facilities, which are direct determinants of health. And then also, levels of immunization are also direct determinants of health. That if your body, or if you're not immunized, you do not have any kind of vaccination, you'll be more vulnerable to falling sick to that disease. So Aditya is asking a question, then what is the use of fifth largest GDP? That is what the question is. That if we are not able to take care of our entire population, then what is the benefit of having this highest, say, or one of the largest economies of the world? So that is what the development paradox is. You see that in terms of development and growth, we are faring well, but we are not able to address basic problems of providing nutrition and food to everyone. We are not able to address the basic problem of providing toilets to everyone, of providing clean drinking water to everyone. That's what I'm talking about. Now you look at this chart, it shows that how you can, say, food insecurity can lead to both forms of malnutrition. That is, one is your undernutrition and the other one is overnutrition. So here in the chart, you find that this depicts undernutrition and this one depicts overnutrition. But both are ultimately caused because of deficiency of nutrients in your body, and particularly micronutrients. So these are various forms of malnutrition. So two happening because of macronutrients and the other one happening because of micronutrients. That is hidden hunger, right? But also remember, it is not necessary that these, again, there cannot be multiple factors, because a person can suffer from both macro and micronutrient deficiencies. Now they are saying that if a person doesn't have access to food, they would not have sufficient food to feed their child, or to feed their children. Then they would have to compromise somewhere on the quantity, quality, and continuity of food. And I'll come to these ideas as well. These are also various degrees of malnutrition. So if they are not able to provide them with sufficient food, they would not have sufficient calorie intake. If they do not have sufficient calorie intake, they do not have sufficient nutritional intake. And it can lead to problems like child stunting and wasting. Similarly, if there is food insecurity, people might have anxiety, stress, etc. because of that. Because of this anxiety, you see that if you are anxious, if you are stressed, you'll not have, say, proper eating habits. You'll eat at any point of time. You'll eat more than that is required. And also you find that if the households are poor, they will rely generally on inexpensive food. Think of your bread. Now bread is cheap, but has a very high, is dense when it comes to calories, but it has no nutrition for that matter. Very low on nutrition, very high on calories, but very cheap. So a person who has a disorder when it comes to their eating habits will take to these kind of foods. Now, these kind of foods will ultimately give you sufficient and more than sufficient calorie intake, but you would not get the required macro and micronutrients for your body, and it can lead to problems of being overweight and obesity. This is how, this is the basic idea about how undernutrition and overnutrition can happen. So it is, again, you remember that it can manifest in multiple ways. One idea is overnutrition, other idea is undernutrition, and then the third idea is hidden hunger, which is becoming a more important problem these days. The deficiency of vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin D has become very normal. Now, it can happen because of your lifestyle, but it can also happen because of caloric deficiency and nutritional deficiency. Then these are the three types of malnutrition that we have already discussed. So, stunting, wasting, and underweight. So, stunting is basically called chronic malnutrition, wasting is called acute malnutrition, and then there is general malnourishment, which is underweight. So, you just have to remember, go through it multiple times, and it will get by hearted. You need not sit and cram it in one go, but just read it again and again. So, we are saying that your malnutrition can happen either because of health indicators or because of food insecurity, that you are not able to get sufficient food or sufficient calories. Also, this food insecurity will extend to nutrition insecurity, and I'll come to that point. But you have to understand, when we think of malnutrition, you have to think of both these factors. And again, when you think of health, there can be multiple determinants of health. In these multiple determinants of health, you see sanitation, availability of clean drinking water, what kind of stress you are having. Then there can be other factors like availability of healthcare services. It can happen because of your lifestyle, etc. So you have already seen various indicators of health when it comes to women. So the same determinants of health will apply here as well, apart from a few women specific ones. So there can be multiple indicators or multiple determinants of health, but because of this health, malnutrition, the problem of malnutrition can occur. And also the problem of food insecurity. Now, when it comes to health, it will be dealt separately, but also whatever is required from health will be covered here with that question on divergence between hunger and poverty. Okay, so what is food insecurity? Food insecurity is a condition where people do not have access to adequate amount of safe and nutritious food for their normal growth and development and to lead a basic active lifestyle. This is what food insecurity is. To make it simple for you, you have to understand that people not being able to access food is food insecurity. Now, if you are not able to access food in adequate amount, so either the quality of food can get compromised, the quantity of food can get compromised, or the continuity of food can get compromised. And we'll come to these ideas with your basic understanding of food insecurity. So this food security can have various levels. You see that if you are not certain about your ability to obtain food, it is a very mild form of food insecurity. Now, this kind of food insecurity can be found in daily wage laborers, that they do not know whether they'll get work tomorrow or not. The second stage is compromising on the quality and variety of food, that you know that you have these 100 rupees. Out of these 100 rupees, you'll be able to afford only chapatis and or say one of the pearls. You would not have fruits as a component of your diet. You would not have any other kind of vegetables as a component of your diet. So basically, you start compromising on the quality of food. You would not get all the nutrients, etc., but at least you get your basic calorie intake. Then it becomes even more severe. How? That once you start compromising on the quantity of food, that you have to skip meals. So you can afford only one meal a day. You have already compromised with the quality of this food, but now you have to compromise with the quantity as well. Then now we have an additional children in the family, and we can afford only one meal a day, which is even more severe form of food insecurity. Then comes the part about continuity, that if a person is not able to get food for a day or more, it is considered to be severe food insecurity, that they do not get work for 2-3 days. They might be having a little saving to get food for tomorrow, but if they are not able to get food for tomorrow, they would have to skip meals the entire day. They would have to, maybe if at all they have clean drinking water, they have to sustain on water. And you would have seen people struggling with these issues around you. Even if you live in urban areas, you'll find that people coming from the poorest strata, people living under the bridges, people living on the footpaths face the severe food insecurity. So there are various stages of food insecurity. Now, what we have to do is we have to basically understand that to take care of malnutrition, to take care of various types of malnutrition like undernutrition, or say rather stunting, wasting, etc., you have to think of health. What are the determinants of health? Then also you have to think of food security, that if people have enough food on their plates, we can somehow ensure that they are not malnourished. And this food security has to get is basically transitioning towards nutrition security. Because having food security, you already know that having food security does not mean that you're getting all the macro and micronutrients. And hidden hunger has become the newest problem for us. And not just India, it is across the globe. So we do not just have to ensure food security, we have to ensure nutrition security, that there is variety of food on their plate, that the food that they're eating is nutritious, which takes care of their macro and micronutrient demands of the body. So this is what the idea is. Now, to address this problem of food security, let's look at various factors which affect food security. Now, the primary factor that impacts food security, and again, I'll tell you this thing, that they have asked a question on this part this year. They've asked a question with a geographical perspective, though, in paper 1. And I had suggested in the last batch, in the last evening batch, I had suggested that there is going to be a question on either food security or nutrition security. Why? Because they haven't asked it, and with your focus on nutrition security, it became important. And also, I suggest you to take up the Kurukshetra magazine for the month of August 23, because it is completely based on nutrition and nutrition security. So it will gain perspective, even though I'm going to cover it in form of questions with this chapter. Need not worry about it, but you still go through it, so that, because it can be used for your leisure reading. So whenever you are traveling in your metro, you're going home, or maybe you're sitting, you are not feeling like studying anything, you can just read this magazine. Okay, anyways, you get your notes, etc., the gist of Kurukshetra available on your app. That is something you can go through, but do read this magazine. It is an interesting read. Coming to the agricultural factors, the first thing is that if we are not able to produce sufficient, how do we ensure that everyone gets food on their plate? If there is a shortage in produce within the country, they would have to either rely on imports from other country, else they would not be able to provide for their entire population. So these factors, these agriculture factors, can be because of agriculture which is unsustainable now. You see that the agriculture has become unprofitable. So if it is not profitable, people are moving away from agriculture, moving towards city in search of better opportunities, which can lead to food insecurity. Why? Because there are lot less people who are engaged in this activity. There is a lot less production from agriculture, which can lead to food insecurity. Then the other idea is that your soil gets eroded because of various factors like flooding of an area. There can be other factors like drought, etc. Then over a period of time, you find that excessive use of fertilizers, excessive use of pesticides can make the soil semi-arid and can also desertify the land. That the soil becomes unfertile for any kind of agricultural practices. Then also over salination, because of more and more absorption of salts from your, say, seawater, etc. This high salinity would not let crops grow. It will also lead to lower production. It will also lead to failure of crops. Then climate change, you already know that most of our farmers in India are dependent on the monsoon for the basic irrigation facilities. If those irrigation facilities are not available, they have to rely on monsoon. And if they have to rely on monsoon and the monsoon is irregular because of climate change, it will directly impact agriculture. Then the last thing is your various disasters. Now, because of landslide, because of drought, because of flood, it can also impact agriculture. And if agriculture is impacted, food security is directly impacted. Then there can be various socio-cultural reasons which affect food security. For instance, there can be gender inequality. We have already discussed that women within a household might be more vulnerable to malnutrition because they do not get adequate share of food. Similarly, poverty, as you have already understood, is a direct factor which impacts food security. If you're poor, you will not be able to buy grains. If you're poor, you will not be able to buy vegetables. Similarly, if the feeding practices are poor, if the parents are not aware what has to be fed to the children, once you grow up, even though at times we are aware, but we are negligent, because this poor feeding practice can happen either because of negligence or because of low awareness levels, that you are not aware what is good for your body and what is not. But look at ourselves. We know that junk food is not good for our health. We know that junk food is going to bring a lot of diseases and problems, but we are negligent. And because of this negligence, we follow those poor feeding practices, which can also impact your food security. Because again, I'm telling you this, that this food security is not just limited to having food on your table. This food security extends to nutrition security as well. Then poor choices of food, having a large family. If there is a large family, the parents would not be able to feed everyone. Then either they have to compromise on quality, else they would have to compromise on quantity of food, which can directly lead to food insecurity, which is basically a factor of malnutrition. Then not having clean drinking water, because of living in slums, not having proper sanitation facilities, which can bring in diseases. Because of these diseases, your body would not be able to absorb nutrition. Just think about this. If you do not have clean drinking water, you might encounter diarrhea. If you have diarrhea, you're losing a lot of nutrients from your body, but because of the diarrhea, not able to have food. And also, if you are poor, you would not be able to afford any kind of healthcare intervention. Then you find that uneven distribution of agricultural resources also affects food security. The simple idea is there are regions, for example, deserted regions, where the soil is not fertile for agriculture. In those regions, you find that in times of inflation, in times of a shortage of production, those regions would not get any share of the crops. For example, say in Haryana and Punjab, a lot of rice, and Western UP, a lot of rice is grown. Now, if because of multiple reasons like lack of irrigation or soil erosion or any other factor, if they are not able to produce as much rice as they do every year, what will happen? There'll be a few regions and there'll be certain sections of the society who would not be able to have rice on their plate, which can also lead to food insecurity and hence malnutrition. Then superstition can also play an important role. Take example, take example of your midday meal scheme. And there was a debate going around midday meal scheme that whether eggs should be included in midday meal or not, because eggs are considered to be non-vegetarian, and there was protest from various people, various families, that our children should not be fed eggs. So this kind of superstition, so they do not understand the nutritional value of an egg, and they question the introduction of eggs in the midday meal. Similarly, there can be other practices. Prolonged fasting for multiple days, because it is a religious practice, that can also lead to malnutrition. Then there can be political factors, because if an area is politically troubled, if there are wars, if there are violent crimes, people would start moving away from there. If there is violence, if there are riots, you see that during wars, what happens? There is a limited supply. Just look at what is happening in Gaza. Every day you find in news that people are not having sufficient to eat. People are not having sufficient drinking water. Why? Because all the supplies have been cut down. Now, because of this ongoing war, there are a lot of people who do not get any share of food. It can also lead to food insecurity and hence malnutrition. Then if there are problems with your public distribution system, because in the case of India, we say that we are food secure. We achieved food security back in the days of Green Revolution, and it was a hit. It was an amazing success. But till today, we find that when it comes to various aspects of hunger or various forms and types of hunger, we are still lagging way behind. So we have food security, but our public distribution system is full of leakages, is full of corruption, because of which the targeted consumer is not getting the due share, because of which there is food insecurity. Then there can be regimes which might discriminate against certain sections of the people, that they would not get them food. Think about the Bengal famine, which happened because of your British rule. What was that? It was a dictatorial regime, and they stopped their supplies. Then there can be policy level problems as well. So there can be problems related to the implementation and design of policy, which can ultimately lead to food insecurity. So what did we say? We said hunger can be equated to malnutrition in our context, because when you look at global hunger index, you'll find that all the types of malnutrition find a mention there. Now this malnutrition can manifest in multiple ways. One is overnutrition, other one is undernutrition, then the third one was hidden hunger. Now hidden hunger can also be present in these two cases. Why? Because it is about micronutrient deficiency. These are about macronutrient deficiency. Now also we were saying that there are multiple types of malnutrition. These are manifestations. Then there are multiple types of malnutrition, like stunting, wasting, and then you have underweight. And we were saying there are multiple factors which cause malnutrition. Now when we look at those factors, one of the factor is health, and the other factor is what? The other factor is food security. Now we can also think of various determinants of health, because these determinants of health will also impact malnutrition. Similarly, there are various factors affecting food security that we have looked into, factors like political, economic, socio-cultural, etc., which can also lead to malnutrition. So we have to understand that malnutrition is not just limited to not being able to obtain food, but it has a wider dimension. Now, before we start with our global hunger index, because I'm sure that we would not be able to even introduce this global hunger index today, we are anyways going to take up this global hunger index in your next session on next Saturday. Just think about that question on divergence for now. When you think about that question on divergence, we were saying that poverty is on a decline, but hunger is on a rise in India. How do you explain this divergence? So one idea is that poverty is directly related to hunger, and the other idea is poverty is not directly related to hunger. So this idea can be easily thought about, that if a person is poor, they would not be able to afford food, so on and so forth. This is done. But this does not explain divergence. This explains the overlap between poverty and hunger. But this idea that poverty and hunger are not directly related explain the divergence. Right? So with this idea, we can say that hunger is not directly related to poverty, because hunger can happen because of multiple factors. Hunger can happen because of various issues related to health. Hunger can happen because of various other political, economic, and social factors. That hunger can happen, or malnutrition can happen, because a person is not aware. They might be having sufficient money, but a person is not aware what to eat, what not to eat. This malnutrition can happen because of our negligence, that we know that this is not healthy food, this can lead to malnutrition, but ultimately we go for that food for the sake of taste. Similarly, this malnutrition can happen because of various other factors as well, that your health is not right, you're not able to absorb nutrition. So this is what explains the divergence in the case of poverty and hunger. And once we are done with your global hunger index, I'll give you one more additional point for that question, and we will take up that question. Do not worry. We'll take up that question again and discuss that question, but in the next session. But for now, please tell me if you have any doubts. So whatever we had read so far has been summarized here, because there's no continuity in the PPT for that matter. So that's why I've summarized it in this form, that malnutrition can manifest in various ways. Malnutrition has multiple types. Malnutrition can happen because of health related issues. Malnutrition can happen because of food security issues or food insecurity. Now, health has multiple determinants. Food security also has multiple factors which impact it. And this is the basic framework. This is the basic framework of hunger. Now, what we'll do is, we are going to, in the next session, we are going to look into this global hunger index. What is this global hunger index? What is India's situation in this global hunger index? What are the problems and criticisms of this global hunger index? And then we'll talk about a few questions related to nutrition, related to hunger, etc. We'll also discuss we'll also discuss okay we'll also discuss your previous year questions. Okay, so no doubt, thank you, great. Balaraj is saying, okay, the PPT has not been replaced yet. Okay, sorry for this. I'll just remind them again. Maybe they would have forgotten, or there might be a technical glitch, because I had informed them and they were saying that they're doing it right away. There might be a technical glitch. I'll just check with them that what is the problem and get it fixed as soon as I can. Yes, you can definitely read the gist of Kurukshetra. Yes, Chinmay, you can. So, Ragni, you are talking about various committees such as Tendulkar Committee, Lakhdawala, Alag Task Force, etc. Are they important for definition of poverty? Now they are not very important from examination point of view. Yes, they can become important from prelims point of view, and that's why it is covered with economy. And they have more to do with measurement. So all you had to understand here was how the idea has changed. So yes, it'll be better if you go through it once. I think it is there in your additional reading material. You can just go through it once, but there was no point discussing all those factors in the class, because it is basically factual information. And how can you include this in answer? Again, it depends on the demand of the question, right? It depends on the demand of the question. If they talk at all about the changing idea of poverty, then you can include them, definitely. But ultimately, if they do not ask a question in that direction, you would not be able to use that data. Okay, then, if you do not have any more questions, let's continue our discussion in the next session on next Saturday. It was a great time with you people. And others who are not engaging in discussion, please do engage in discussion. It is going to be a wonderful learning experience for you. Thank you for today, and let's meet in the next session. Good night.